Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we break down the latest in free agency, Pete Alonso, Alex Bregman, and yes, the bullpen. We also answer a ton of your questions throughout the entire show. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every single episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today and subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, leave a mailbag question with that review. We'll answer it on the show. Same for YouTube. If you ask mailbag questions in the comments under there as well, those could appear in the show. And more importantly, we are getting down to the wire. Please vote for the Mets Pod if you haven't in the best baseball podcast category of the Sports Podcast Awards. All you have to do is head over to sportspodcastawards.com. But if you're watching on YouTube right now, it's even easier. Here's the QR code that will take you right there. The deadline's approaching, by the way. We need you. Please and thank you. All right, Joe, let's jump right into it. Not a lot happening, a little bit of rumors and a lot of bit of waiting on the side of Pete Alonso. But besides all of that, I'm not saying Happy New Year to you because it is too late. But hello and welcome, Joe.
Connor, how are we doing?
I'm feeling quite great. I feel like this is the point of the baseball offseason, though, where the childish part of me goes, like, it's the meme with the guy poking with the stick saying, do something. I just want anything, something, a bullpen arm. I don't need the splash, just anything. Hopefully everybody's back to work after the holidays here.
The baseball offseason is so unique because it's one of those things where not a lot happens in November, and everyone's like, well, it's early. And then the winter meetings happen, and some things happen. And then there's a couple weeks span in December where a little more happens between the winter meetings and the holidays. And it's like, well, break for the holidays. Other than the Mets, who signed Sean Manaea and got us off of our holiday break. And now it's heading into January. We're into 2025, getting closer to the middle of January. So now I can understand as the fan, the anxiety setting in, like, can we figure out something with Pete Alonso? Are we figuring something out with Pete Alonso? Are they doing anything else with the rotation? As you said, relievers. I looked and counted on MLB Trade Rumors free agent list, and some of them may have signed minor league deals somewhere and they weren't crossed off the list, but there's in a neighborhood of like 90 relievers available. So there are a lot of pitchers out there that are looking for jobs. And yeah, we're getting to the point where we're about to be a month out from pitchers and catchers. So let's go. Let's get things moving, baseball.
Yeah, and you're right. That's why we see so many guys take deals that first real week of the offseason, or not so many guys, but deals where you might go, okay, he was just ready to sign, because the money drying up is a real thing. Those offers are there. The baseball offseason is very high tide and low tide. And when you go through that winter meetings aspect of it, you kind of look around and things are moving. And then, like you said, Joe, during the holidays, it all kind of stops. I mean, we're talking about Tanner Scott is out there. Somebody the Mets, per The Athletic, Will Salmon said that they've met with, and he's one of the more high leverage arms. I mean, bringing in Tanner Scott would be a situation. We'll talk more about this later, but that would be a situation where that's the higher end of the market. You're looking for a true bridge to Diaz. But before we get into a lot of the depth of, the relief market and all that, because it's a deeper combo, we always have to start with Pete Alonso. Joe, I thought you had a really interesting, quote tweet on this situation, because I think it kind of highlights part of the issue with all of this. And the ultimate summary of it is Scott Boras is reportedly using Prince Fielder's 9-year, $214 million contract as a comparison for what Pete should get. That was quite some time ago. As you very well pointed out, this is a different world, and the first base market is just not the same anymore. I think we've grown analytically. Teams have become a little sharper in their free agent investments, or honestly where they want to allocate more risk and where they want to limit risk. And I'm not sitting here saying for sure that Scott Boras and Pete Alonso are saying we're not signing until we get that exact deal. But I think it shows you, Joe, what they were once hoping for and obviously still hoping for. Baseball as a league entirely has appeared to move on from that kind of contract at this position.
I just want to say this, Connor. If that, I mean, that report, I believe, is from Bob Nightingale. If that report is accurate, that Scott Boras is still, as of today, seeking that. It's one thing if you asked for that in November, but also Prince Fielder had to retire at like 32 due to injuries. That is not the example to give to be like, you know what? You should give a long-term deal to this first baseman at 30 because Prince Fielder, who retired at 32 due to injuries, got that long of a deal. I guess I'm not as smart as Scott Boras, but that one to me doesn't pass the sniff test. And the sport, Connor, to your point, I think it has gotten to a combination of stingy and smart.
Right.
I think teams are obviously much smarter. There's a lot of Ivy League at the top of front offices. And I think mitigating risk is a huge thing. I think the Mets have shown this with their willingness to offer Teoscar Hernandez a 2-year deal, their willingness to sign Frankie Montas for potentially more money than he quote unquote was worth for just because they were able to get it on the short term. Teams are willing to pay more money. They don't want to pay term. And Pete Alonso is in a spot. And I just want to say, I see all you Mets fans in our comments. I see you on my Twitter feed. Be nice to Pete Alonso. He is doing his right now. This is his only true big shot at free agency. He is trying to maximize his earnings, just like Francisco Lindor did, just like Juan Soto did. This doesn't mean Pete Alonso doesn't want to be a Met because he hasn't signed with the Mets yet. Pete Alonso does not owe the Mets anything just because he was drafted and developed. He doesn't owe them anything. But there is going to be a time, I think, conceptually, sooner than later, that he and Scott Boras are going to have to read the room and realize the contract that they were hoping to obtain is simply not going to be there.
I think it's really well put by you. And I think it's the combo, ironically, as you just stated, is no longer, forget 9 years, 214. And what a disaster of a deal that was, like you said. I mean, Fielder was a guy that in his 30s, very short-lived, never hit 25 home runs. He had a medical retirement. But I think the combo is no longer in the realm of, hey, is Pete going to get a 6-year deal? Is Pete going to get a 7-year deal? We are beyond any of that conversation. I think the combo has turned, Joe, where Scott Boras with Pete Alonso and with the teams that are interested in, and we don't really have legitimate concrete info what teams are dying to sign Pete Alonso besides the Mets. Yeah, we've heard teams, rumored to be circling, but nothing like, hey, this team offered Pete Alonso 4 years. This team offered Pete Alonso, non-Mets teams offered him 3 years. I think the combo, Joe, now becomes for them, what is our plan here? Do we take, if the Mets offer us 3 years, do we just take it and say, hey, that's 80 plus million more than we had yesterday, and that's pretty good money, and it's a market where Pete Alonso is a marketable guy, right? He's in the home run derby. He's a slugger. He does a lot of charity work. He's loved by fans, especially younger fans with the polar bear nickname. I think people need to wrap their heads around sometimes. Yeah, the salary you make for playing a sport is one thing, but where you play, the marketing opportunities are another big factor in all of this. And in this situation, that's good for the Mets. Or are they looking at this and going, hey, last year was an outlier. I hit 34 home runs. In my career before that, I was more of a guy that was a 40-plus home run guy. 46 in 2023, 40 in 2022. Okay, yeah, he hit 37 in 2021, but he also had an 863 OPS that year. And then his rookie year in 19, 53 home runs. Does Pete have the confidence to say, I'm going to take a 2-year deal or get an opt-out after 1 year because I think I'm going to hit 50 home runs this year. And then somebody is going to pay me the contract that I want. That's, I think, where this has gone, Joe, where it's on them now to figure out what they want. Like this is not a 6 year. And the one thing that does drive me a little crazy, and I think a lot of Met fans, fortunately, are, much smarter than this. But when I hear, even from media people, say, just get it done, just do 5 years. We're not living in that world anymore. It's gone right now. You don't have to do that if you're the Mets. You won that part already. So I think that's where this has gone, where I am not fascinated to see Pete Alonso's contract thinking, will he, won't he get a long-term deal, Joe? I'm fascinated to see if it's a 3-year deal and what the structure of it is in terms of being able to do this all again next year, because I'd put the odds very likely that that's going to be the case.
I think it's honestly a near certainty at this point that Pete Alonso is going to have to take a deal, whether that's 3 years with an opt-out after every year. Maybe he could get a 4th year, like maybe. Like that is, to me, the high end as far as a length of contract could go. But one thing that you talk about the other teams potentially interested, I said this a few weeks ago, I'm going to say it again, who is interested in Pete Alonso? And I feel bad saying it because Pete Alonso is obviously a good baseball player, and he's been a great player for the Mets since the day they called him up. The Angels, there's been insiders like Ken Rosenthal and Robert Murray have kind of poo-pooed that one a bit. The Giants, that's another team that people talk about. Is Pete Alonso really going to want to go to Oracle Park to reestablish his value?
No.
That is not a good spot for him. And another factor there, their top prospect, first-round pick, Bryce Eldridge, who made it up to AAA this past year, is a first baseman, and the Giants refused to include him in a deal to acquire either Garrett Crochet or who was the other guy that was traded that was good? Don't remember, but Bryce Eldridge was off limits in trade talks for the Giants is really the moral of the story. So why are they signing Pete Alonso when they have Bryce Eldridge kind of knocking on the door? The Cubs have always been like a rumored team, but they like Michael Busch, and Matt Shaw is pushing for third base, so you can't really shift Matt Busch to third. If there is a true Pete Alonso suitor out there, please stand up, because I'm unaware that that team actually exists, and we are spending time, I believe, trying to develop a candidate almost out of like, yeah, Pete Alonso's gonna, tell the Mets to buzz off and go somewhere else. I am stretching to figure out a team that fits for him.
I'm with you all the way. Maybe we're just optimistic on the Mets side of things here, but there's not a lot of reason.
I just want to say, Connor, at this point, and this is not source, this is Joe's opinion, I would be surprised if Pete Alonso was not back in a Mets uniform.
Yeah, I think we've been pretty steadfast about that, though, on this podcast, because it does make sense for both sides. I mean, the Mets still need offense. We're not like looking at this and going, hey, Pete, make a move or else you're in trouble. It's also, hey, Mets, you're not done yet either. And I think what's interesting about that, Joe, is that in all of this, with the way the market moved, there hasn't really been a ton about Alex Bregman. And I don't know if that's a situation that, is he another guy that, thought, hey, I'll get to the market in 6 or 7 years, is just going to be right in front of me, and that's that. And the money I want, and it's over. I mean, Bregman is complicated because you could sit there and do that, and we've done this before. If the Mets don't want Pete back, Vientos plays first, and you can go get Bregman. But with Bregman, you have to ask yourself, too, what's the reason he's still out there? Because this was one of the guys that we thought would be a pretty desired commodity in this free agent market. And you have to imagine, much like Pete, Bregman's just holding on for more term as well that hasn't come his way yet.
It's interesting because you talked about it, Connor, at the top of the show here. Timing in baseball free agency is imperative. And Alex Bregman turned down a 6-year deal from the Houston Astros early in the offseason. I think it was 6 for $150 something. And he turned it down thinking he was going to get over $200 million. And, perhaps he still does. I still think an Alex Bregman market exists. I could clearly name teams that I think are in on Alex Bregman. To me, if the Mets don't want Pete Alonso, I don't see David Stearns pivoting to giving Alex Bregman a long-term contract. Now, we can have a debate if you want. If they're both settling for short-term with opt-out kind of deals, would you rather have the thump of Pete Alonso or the bat the ball skills, defense, and some power and, honestly, championship pedigree for whatever that's worth? Like, would you rather have that and you shift Vientos over to first? I think that's a debate that is potentially worth having. But where we stand today, January 7th, I still think Alex Bregman's going to find his way to that 5-year, 6-year type of contract, whereas maybe it's naive of me. I just don't see that happening for Alonso.
Yeah, no, I'm with you all the way on that one. All right, so that's where it stands with the offense right now. And do you have any feel on timeline here, Joe? I mean, because we've heard this could just carry all the way into spring training at this point.
They're staring, and Scott Boras is not afraid to stare for quite some time. So I don't have a feel for when it could happen. It could be tomorrow. It could be in February. I don't think this is going to carry like deep into March, like JD Martinez and things like that did, because there's a point in time where on Boras and Alonso's side, you got to kind of think realistically that, okay, even if someone's first baseman gets hurt, that doesn't mean they're going to come with a 5 or 6 year deal for Pete Alonso. So your guess is as good as mine on timeline, but I think we definitely are trending towards having a little bit of time before we have a potential Pete Alonso emergency podcast.
All right,
as long as it's past Friday, Connor. As long as it's past Friday.
Yes. Let's get into a mailbag question here. This is Jeff in Atlantic City. Thank you for the 5-star review on Apple Podcast. Here's a fair offer that meets Pete's wants and the Mets' needs. 26 opt-out /20. So this is with 1/3 of the money deferred. And opt-outs each of those last 4 years. Oh, so, okay, let me reread this. This was a little bit of difficult wording. I got it now. Yeah. 26 million with an opt-out, and then 4 years of 20 mil per year. So in short order, this is a 6-year, $132 million deal. 1/3 of the money is deferred, which of course is going to help the tax here. I'll get to the rest of Jeff's thoughts here. He said the Mets get the good chance it's only a 2-year deal. The opt-outs and deferrals on the back end entice Pete to opt out late in the deal, and the deferred money is enough to make it easy to cut him loose if necessary. So this is very creative, Jeff. Number one, I want to give you credit for that. And it's not really that expensive in the grand scheme of things. I think the issue is you need to live in a world a little bit sometimes of Murphy's Law. What if what we saw last year is what Pete Alonso is now, right? It wasn't just a down year. And it wasn't a dreadful year. He had a 788 OPS, which he's a better player than that, and he's supposed to be. But he hit 34 home runs. He had some big moments in the postseason. But let's say the next 2 years, which are the guaranteed years of this deal, that's what he is, a sub 800 OPS player. And that means he has the choice at age, so Pete would be
32?
32 when the opt-out comes up. At 32, he would have to think, I have $80 million guaranteed in front of me for the next 4 years. Joe, I don't know if he's going to get more money than that on the opt-out, and you're realistically stuck with those 4 years, which, 20 mil, I get it's deferred, it's easy to cut loose, but this was part of the thought process with the Brandon Nimmo deal. So how many deals do you want to do this with, is my question. So you tell me your thoughts, Joe. I personally would not offer this. I love the creativity and the idea, but this is it's still too rich for me.
I won't be shocked if Pete's contract with whoever he signs with, and as I said, I believe that will be the Mets. I won't be shocked if it is creative to some degree.
Oh, yeah.
I don't see a situation in where in which the Mets are going to offer Pete Alonso a deal that has the potential to be a 6-year contract. I just don't think so. I don't think David Stearns wants to do that. And frankly, while I'm totally with you, I appreciate the creativity here. And I think it's a unique contract that Scott Boras and Pete Alonso would probably love to get offered. I think they would sign that pretty quickly. The Mets don't have any incentive to do it other than the social media post and popping that they signed Pete Alonso really soon. David Stearns has sat out this market, and he let all the other first basemen go somewhere else. I don't think he does that if he doesn't believe he's going to quote unquote win this staring match with Scott Boras. And ultimately this deal ends up in the 3 to 4 range, has some opt-outs in there, maybe some deferred money, different things along those lines. But I just don't see a world in which the Mets are going to be willing to offer a contract that could take Pete Alonso to his age 36 season or whatever it would be.
Yeah, it's well put. Like I said, like the idea. Good news is I just don't think the Mets have to do this. It's just a lot of guaranteed money that they don't need to pony up at this moment. All right, let's get into the bullpen. We did promise we're going to talk a little bullpen today. Both Andy Martino and Will Salmon have been all over this. That the Mets, met with Tanner Scott. They are at least circling that market. There's obviously other options for a quality setup man. The MLB.com had a good article from Thomas Harrigan. It was the 17 best relievers left on the free agent market. And, he put Scott in the top tier with Jeff Hoffman. And then after that, it was, guys we've talked about on this show, Joe, in the second tier, longtime closers that are still getting it done despite being up there in age. Kirby Yates, David Robertson, Kenley Jansen. I think, Joe, there's a good chance the Mets come out of this offseason with one of those 5 guys. I really do. I think it goes back to a combo you and I had on our New Year's resolution segment last week that I don't think the Mets want to risk going into the deadline and saying, oh, great, we have to send a top 10 prospect to get relief help. And yeah, they did a pretty good job last year of not doing that, but they didn't get a slam the door every outing kind of guy. They went cheap volume where, Maton had his moments until the postseason. Stanek had his moments in the postseason. So getting a high leverage arm, Joe, feels pretty important on the checklist right now.
I think, Connor, this is other than, figuring out the first base, third base situation. I think this is the biggest need that the Mets have left. They need somebody to stabilize the back end of that bullpen, somebody to, whether that's interchanging with Edwin Diaz or just being the 8th inning guy to Edwin Diaz. And look, I think the league, and I said this on last week's show, I think the league has somewhat smartened up when it comes to these reliever contracts. You might be able to get Tanner Scott for 3 years instead of the 4 or 5 years that he might have gotten a couple years ago. You might be able to get Carlos Estevez for 2 years. You might be able to get Jeff Hoffman for 3. Guys like David Robertson, Kirby Yates are older pitchers, so they qualify as 1-year options. I think it is imperative that David Stearns and the Mets come out of this offseason with that minimum one reliever that you could count on to be the bridge to Edwin Diaz. Ideally, it's 2 to 3, but if the Mets can get someone like Tanner Scott, that is a true impact reliever. His only flaw, he walks some guys. But he walks some guys, and he doesn't give up hits. He doesn't give up home runs. Strikes everybody out, throws up to 100 miles an hour from the left side. That is the kind of dynamic back of game duo that you see some of the great teams in baseball have. If the Mets can put together Edwin Diaz and Tanner Scott, that would be, I think, very exciting and would make a difference considering the way the Mets built their starting rotation, where there's not that proven ace, that frontline guy that you could totally count on for, 190 innings, 200 innings, and frontline performance. Being able to shorten the game is huge.
It really is. I mean, I think back to this a lot, and it's a dangerous way to think, Joe, but if Brooks Raley and Drew Smith didn't get hurt last year, I sit there and sometimes wonder what could have been for the Mets in the postseason. And I don't know if I'm not saying it wins them a World Series, but losing those guys was a gigantic domino effect. Even when you look at Dednell Nunez, who
Yeah.
was lights out in the middle of the summer and got hurt. And you're right. It's not just walking away with, Tanner Scott or one of those top 5 guys we mentioned, but do you even button up a different part of the bullpen? And we always jokingly talk about Andrew Chafin, but you're in that kind of mold. An Andrew
Yeah.
Chafin, if you want a lefty, do you look at a Carlos Estevez, a Kyle Finnegan, these kinds of guys? That you nailed it. That the amount of names out there it's wild. And I think for the Mets that play in a different world of cash, the way you capitalize on that advantage is on the 1-year market when that's all that's left in free agency. And we'll get there. Like for relievers, there's going to be a lot of solid relievers that take 1-year deals. You sit there and go, hey, we got the cash to do this that other teams don't, and we're fine.
Someone's going to fall through the cracks. Happens every single year. And the Mets, I think, need to be ready to be opportunistic for that. To me, I need that one. It doesn't have to be Tanner Scott specifically, but it has to be someone in that tier to be the 8th inning guy. And then from there, I am totally game with David Stearns playing the value game, the wait things out, and how he has historically built great bullpens dating back to his time in Milwaukee. I'm good with that, but I need that locked in guy.
I mean, I want Stanek back just for the postseason. Historically,
you don't have to tell me twice.
Yeah.
I'm in.
I think that's a reunion that makes way too much sense not to happen. Pretty cost effective as well. All right, speaking of pitching, a couple of Roki Sasaki questions here. No surprise. Zen Winky, thank you for the 5-star review on Apple Podcast. If the Mets are lucky enough to get a call from Roki's agent saying he will sign with them for the slot max, keep in mind international signing money, folks, is what's going to take to sign Sasaki. Are they able to trade assets to acquire more international signing bonus money? Are there any limits so they could sign both Roki and the shortstop they have been associated with? And then another question on Sasaki. This is from YouTube, Mortgage Mentor Mike on YouTube. If the Mets sign Sasaki, how long before they can extend his contract? Not sure of all the rules of international signings. I know they have full control for 6 years, but could they offer him a massive extension after year 1?
All right, let's try to take these a couple. I know we
unpack them bit by bit.
Let's go piece by piece. Can the Mets trade assets to acquire more international signing bonus money? Yes, they can. They can trade for up to 60% of their pool. Their pool is $6 million and change, so you could get 60% of that number. That's the max that you're allowed to get. I do not believe that would get you both Roki Sasaki and the shortstop that they've been associated with, Elian Pena. We'll give him a name because the international signing, he's pretty good. He is. If Roki Sasaki was not a part of this international class, Elian Pena was the top ranked guy in this international signing period. So the Mets are getting a top flight shortstop prospect that is projected to get in the neighborhood of $5 million. I don't think the Mets can trade for 60% of their pool, sign Sasaki, and then go to Elian Pena and go, well, how about you just take less money instead? And because, look, he could go ahead and shop himself elsewhere. And there are teams that didn't spend international bonus money or aren't slated to. The Dodgers, for example, don't have a big commitment in this class, which is, I think, a reason a lot of people link Sasaki to the Dodgers. All right, if the Mets sign Sasaki, they could just sign Elian Pena instead. And so I don't think the situation of getting both of them is plausible. As far as how long before they could extend his contract, I do not know a written rule related to that. But what I can say is MLB keeps a very, very close eye on things like that to avoid situations like this. You go back to when the Angels signed Shohei Ohtani, MLB was on top of that to make sure they didn't kind of manipulate and and say, all right, you signed, we're following the rules. You signed for $2 million or $3 million, whatever it was. And then a year from now, we'll give you a long-term big money contract. So there's some time frame in which it's maybe allowed or not allowed, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, so that's the short answer on that is, Joe, like you can't really do it. It looks kind of.
The Braves got in a lot of trouble, if you recall, for international, like manipulating the international bonus pool. Like it got some guy banned for life from baseball.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Someone got fired and they lost a bunch of international free agents. So MLB is very much on top of that. And this is such a unique situation. They're going to be watching it with an absolute hawkeye. They're not going to let Steve Cohen or the Guggenheim Group out in LA sign Roki Sasaki for $6 million, then in 8 months give him a 10-year, $350 million contract.
They don't want this to turn into NIL in college football now. Literally, like where there are no regulations, there's no cap on anything. And hey, if you got the most money, go get the players you want to get. They're not going to allow that for the international signing period. All right, you're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. Let's go down on the farm. And we got another 5-star review question on Apple Podcasts. Thank you, Avika19. With all the discussion about Pete Alonso and first base, there's been little mention of Ryan Clifford. Will he get a shot at first base for the Mets? Joe, before I toss this to you, I would like to remind our lovely audience that Ryan Clifford just turned 21 years old this summer.
Yes, he's a young man, and he got to the AA level and had a lot of success. 18 home runs in just a percentage of the season. He slowed down a bit, towards the end of the season, but he is a guy that could be the long-term first baseman for the Mets. We talk about Pete Alonso and him signing a deal 3 to 4 years, maybe an opt-out. And if we play the situation that you presented, Connor, all right, he hits 50 home runs in 2025 and he opts out and he's back in the free agent pool. The Mets aren't like a lock to keep him beyond that. The Mets certainly wouldn't be a lock to sign Vladimir Guerrero Jr. if he is to make it to free agency. So it's certainly possible that the long-term first baseman for the Mets is Ryan Clifford. He has more growth to do. I think one thing that I would say from my vantage point, he could really stand to be a little bit more aggressive in the strike zone. You look up his on-base percentage, his walks, those are great numbers. His strikeout
359
numbers
in AA.
His strikeout numbers are staggeringly high. Part of that is when I've seen him in person a handful of times and watch a bunch of games on my computer. It feels like at times Ryan Clifford is by design trying to work the count instead and letting some pitches that maybe he could really do impact to get by. I think he could stand in 2025 to still utilize his eye that he has. He has a great eye for the strike zone, but also if that fastball comes early in the count, jump on it because he has legitimate potential 25, 30 home run type of strength in that bat going forward. He just needs to kind of clean up some things. And as you mentioned kind of at the outset of the question, let's not forget he's a 21-year-old kid.
It's wild how Schwarber-esque his numbers profile, it feels like at every level, Joe. I mean, 231 average in almost 100 Binghamton games last year, but 359 on base, 18 home runs. Like you said, he is on base and power kind of guy, which
and strikeout is a three true outcomes. He is a definition of that.
Right, and you can't forget, obviously, the strikeouts. So you don't need him to come up here and hit 260, but you'd like him to, like you said, maybe take advantage of some of those situations and hit even more home runs. And it's a 21-year-old player that we've really enjoyed watching grow, and we will continue watching him grow. He starts the season in Binghamton, Joe?
Yeah, he'll go back to AA. Yeah.
That'd be a jarring jump to AAA.
He can earn his way up there if he goes to AA and he hits. He'll make his way to AAA, I suspect, sometime in 2025.
Right. I mean, so say he plays in AA and he makes it to AAA by July, he'd still be turning 22 while in AAA. that season. I mean, that just
Yeah.
goes to show you how young he is. All right, we got some more questions here. This is from Football Nut on YouTube. Is Stearns building up a trade for this offseason? At his end of the year presser, he spoke heavily about being involved in the trade market, but nothing so far. Can we still see a trade for a starter? What do you think of this, Joe? It feels like if this happens, it's going to be something we do not expect at
Yeah.
all with the way Stearns operates, especially the way the trade market typically operates as well. But we've seen trades for pitching happen well after the new year all the time.
I don't know about starter. I know that was kind of like the end of the question. I don't think the Mets are out on acquiring another starter, but I think it would be pure opportunity cost. In that article that Will Salmon wrote at The Athletic, where he spoke about the Mets meeting with Tanner Scott, kind of like nestled in there that maybe not many people paid attention to, he talked about the Mets potentially considering trades for relievers. Now, that is where it could be incredibly unpredictable. Sure, Ryan Helsley could be out there from the St. Louis Cardinals, but the Mets also made a random trade, a couple of years ago to get Brooks Raley. Came out of nowhere. No one talked about Brooks Raley. Just one day, there was a tweet. I want to say, and this is weird that I remember this stuff. I think it was Mike Puma who was just like, "Oh, the Mets trade for Brooks Raley," and that's the kind of thing I think that can pop out of nowhere. Where I stand now is, I think maybe a month and a half ago, I had a thought that Stearns had a big trade in his bag this winter. I think if there is a trade to be made before spring training, it might be, maybe in a smaller variety rather than that Luis Castillo trade or that Garrett Crochet trade. Those big deals that we talked about on this show, it feels like those may have kind of fallen off to the side, and maybe a smaller trade is something that could be in the works.
Yeah, what typically happens with those situations, and you brought up the two perfect names, right? Crochet, a team like that in the White Sox, they were determined to move him, and they were going to find the best potential deal. Where they sat there and said, okay, we're going to field all the offers, and we found one we like, and we're moving this guy because the time is now. I think with Castillo, it's a good example of what a lot of other teams do, where we can move him if we think this benefits us from a flexibility standpoint and the move we're going to make after this. But we can also just wait until the trade deadline and get more if we don't like what's in front of us right now. So that's the tricky part where you probably sit here and go, okay, maybe the window for that kind of move. Now, to be fair, it's you think of Bassett a couple of years ago, like that was a pretty late trade, but
Yeah,
typically, Joe, like the high profile starters, I kind of agree with you. It feels like teams have to make those moves because then if you can't, you got to go into the free agent market and get somebody or make a second move where, sometimes it's just teams gauging the market and what's there.
for sure. That's definitely the balance of an MLB offseason is the timing of trades and what you have to give up in trade versus what you only have to give up in dollars for a free agent.
All right, we got another one from Alan Weinman, 1081. This is on YouTube as well. How about giving Noah Syndergaard a tryout for spot starting and long relief, or is he just done? So a reminder, Syndergaard did not pitch in the majors last year. His last major league appearances was 2023. He made 18 starts, 12 with the Dodgers, 6 with the Cleveland Guardians. And it was not pretty. It was a combined 6.5 ERA, and the long ball was really eating him up. 22 home runs, Joe, in just 88 2/3 innings.
I didn't have talking about Noah Syndergaard on my bingo card for this offseason. I don't know if Noah Syndergaard has any more of a big league future. I guess I could be off base and wouldn't rule it out, but I think if Noah Syndergaard wants to pitch in 2025, he would have to accept a minor league deal from somebody and go to camp and kind of see what it's all about. To me, he looks the part of a guy that's probably done. And I would say with kind of the quantity, because something we haven't talked about on the show, and we'll talk more about it, I think, as we get closer to spring training. The Mets have brought in like a quantity of potential relief options on minor league deals that are coming in to compete for a spot on the team. I don't know if Noah Syndergaard needs to be added to that list.
No, it's been a tough road for him, obviously. The last report we kind of got of him was in November from John Heyman, and that was that Syndergaard had dropped 30 pounds. He was kind of trying to change his body and hoping to get another chance. He's now 235 pounds on his comeback road. The problem is, he had 15 teams attend throwing sessions the previous winter and didn't get back in the league in 2024.
Yeah.
So analytically, like stuff-wise, there would have to be something different he's showing in workouts this winter for that to change and get into a camp this year. We'll see. I agree with you. It's, no need for the Mets, but it's a good segue, Joe, to your point that the Mets have brought in a lot of arms that still do have good stuff and are guys that can bounce between the minors and the majors. And, you think about, I always forget the number you said of how many pitchers pitched for the Mets last year, but whatever you're looking,
I think it was 35.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
Like whenever you go into a season and you're looking at everything in front of you, it's amazing by the time you look 3 months later to June, and it's largely all different. And that could be injury, performance, but that's why you want somebody like Stearns, that one of his high prize qualities is finding depth out of places that most people don't.
Guys like Chris Davinsky, guys like Rico Garcia, guys like Anthony Goes, guys like Brandon Waddell from Korea. Those are just a handful of names. Oliver Ortega. Like, those are a handful of names that if you're listening to this show, there's a decent chance that you have never heard of any of them, but they are all on minor league deals with invites to Mets big league spring training for this year, and they're there to compete for a job on the back end of the bullpen, or as you said, the importance of depth where they could be in AAA Syracuse. And those are guys that we're going to be paying attention to as we cycle through spring training, because the Mets are going to add to this bullpen, but I don't think they're going to add 4 more relievers on big league contracts and lock everything in. So these guys are going to have opportunity. That's simply the way David Stearns does things.
And if you missed last week's show, we talked about, Joe had an article on SNY.TV. If you missed it, you could still go there and read it. The 4 of the 5 impact prospects you had written pitchers. I mean, Brandon Sproat, stating the obvious, everybody listening to the show knows who he is, but Blade Tidwell, Nolan McLean, Jonathan Pintaro, like those are guys that they fall into the bracket of they could be in play at some point of the regular season too, and get involved in making an impact and holding down a spot. So, all right, Joe, the long winter continues as we wait for whatever surrounds Pete Alonso in this chase. You got any closing thoughts for me today?
The reliever market, hopefully that dam is starting to break a little bit. It has to break soon, and I think the Mets are well positioned to make a potential impactful reliever signing. It's going to be very interesting to see, because, meeting with Tanner Scott, it doesn't mean they offer him a big contract. It doesn't mean they're going to sign him, but they're not meeting with Tanner Scott just because they feel like it. So clearly the Mets have an eye and potential willingness to make a substantial bullpen addition. And maybe when we hop on the show next week, that could be something we're talking about, a legitimate bullpen arm added to the bullpen.
Yeah, and I think the Mets being that in on the higher end of the relief market just goes to show you, after signing Juan Soto, where they think they are. Like, gone are the days of, hey, not just we're going to make a run at it this year, or hey, it's a transition year. We are trying to build a team that is built for the postseason every single year and equipped for that. And it goes back to our combo around, like, hey, you don't want to be buying a bullpen at the trade deadline. You can buy pieces. You don't want to be buying a bullpen at the trade deadline. And we expect some movement there soon. This is the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Please subscribe, of course, at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. You can leave us a review with a question. And as you heard today, we'll use it for a future mailbag. Same with the YouTube comments there. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber over there as well. And I ask and urge you one final time. Just kidding. I'm sure I'll ask at some point again. Maybe. We'll see. Please vote for us. SportsPodcastAwards.com. Best baseball podcast, the Mets Pod. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.